So with this video on respiration, I'm primarily going to focus on a process called pulmonary ventilation. And I want to first distinguish that from external respiration and internal respiration. And then focusing in on pulmonary ventilation, I want to look at how it is that volume changes drive pressure changes in the flow of air with our breathing, inhalation and exhalation. And then looking at three factors that are going to influence how easily we breathe. And so those are going to be airway resistance, alveolar surface tension, and then a phenomenon called lung compliance.
Pulmonary ventilation is very much the process of what we think of as breathing, right? Where we're actually taking in oxygen molecules, we're inhaling, and we're breathing out mostly CO2, right? So that, again, is this idea of pulmonary ventilation, inhalation, and exhalation. So you can't think about the respiratory system without bringing in the circulatory system. And so with external respiration, so this is going to be the exchange of gases, so oxygen and CO2, between the lungs and the bloodstream. So it's going to specifically be looking at what is going on here with the gases. With internal respiration, as you might guess, so this is all, again, looking at the exchange of gases, oxygen and CO2, but instead of looking at pulmonary circulation and what's going on there, we are now looking at the exchange of gases between the tissues and the bloodstream. And so that's going to be what we refer to as our internal respiration. So to say a little bit more about external respiration, I want you to appreciate just how much pressure gradients are going to drive gas exchange in the body, right? So we don't have to depend on any sort of ATP in our cells. It is all passive diffusion. So in our blood, right, we know coming back from the tissues that we're going to be carrying a lot of CO2. That's why they're shown in blue. And we similarly know that in our lungs, we are going to have a relatively low concentration of CO2 relative to this. So what you end up seeing simply is that CO2 is going to diffuse, and this is a simplified figure, of course, right? It's not diffusing into this massive space, but into the alveoli, right? So CO2 will diffuse from our blood into our lungs. On the venous side, technically. And then similarly, coming over here, right, you have oxygen. So taking in a breath, we're going to be getting a high concentration of oxygen in those alveoli, and that is going to simply diffuse into the capillaries as they go past. And so again, that is this idea of external respiration, gas exchange between the lungs and the blood going past, between our pulmonary circulation. And with internal respiration, gas exchange between systemic blood supply and tissues, right, and organs of the body. So here, right, think about metabolism, right? So tissues that are working are producing CO2, right? So they are producing CO2, and that CO2 in the tissues is going to be at a higher concentration than it will be in the blood as it goes past. So that CO2 can simply diffuse right into those capillary beds. On the flip side, with oxygen, right, a major goal of our systemic circulation is to carry that oxygen to the tissues. So as that oxygen travels to these capillary beds, it's going to be at a high concentration in these capillary beds relative to the tissues. And so oxygen will simply diffuse from that blood supply into our tissues. And so you see gases moving in the opposite direction with internal respiration versus external respiration. But in both scenarios, it's very much passive diffusion, partial pressure gradients that are driving that movement of air.
Okay, so now to hone in on pulmonary ventilation. Very much this mechanical process that's going to depend on volume changes. And we're going to specifically define this with regard to Boyle's law. And so lots of real world examples here. So bubbles. what you tend to see with bubbles is that as they rise to the surface from lower depths, they increase in size. And conversely, if you were to drag a balloon underwater, it would be more and more compressed. So as pressure from the water increases as you go down, the volume in the balloon decreases. Pressure goes up, volume goes down. The reverse scenario, as that bubble rises, pressure decreases and the volume of the balloon or the bubble expands. This guy right here, this is his bladder coming out of his mouth. So it's called barotrauma. So they're used to living in deep sea waters, and as they're brought to the surface, that significant drop in pressure leads to this volume increase, and their bodies don't have the capacity to hold organs that have the ability to expand like this. Another nice example is a syringe, right? So if you imagine pulling on this syringe, what you're essentially doing is increasing the volume in this chamber. Volume goes up, pressure goes down. And what it's really doing is creating a vacuum that will then draw in the fluids. So it's very much like that in the lungs. And with Boyle's law, so here's the formal equation, and you can just as easily think about it in the terms that I've laid out here. So pressure varies inversely with volume. As one goes up, the other goes down. That's it. And it's an intuitive process if you think about some of the examples that I've just given. But with breathing, with our ventilation, it's these volume changes that drive these pressure changes. And then these pressure changes then are going to cause gases to flow so that they can come to an equilibrium. Here, I want to define some terms just with these various pressures before we get going. So your lungs, your diaphragm, intrapulmonary pressure, P subscript PUL, pulmonary, is referring to the pressure inside the lungs. I'm also going to be describing atmospheric pressure, right? So at sea level, 760 millimeters of mercury. We also have intrapleural pressure, which is the pressure in our pleural cavity, right? So between our visceral pleura and our parietal pleura lies this cavity. What we see with this intrapleural pressure, P subscript IP, is that it's always going to be lower than the pulmonary pressure. And that's essentially to ensure that the lungs don't collapse, right? If the pressure here were to be greater, it would be squeezing or pressing on our lungs. Let's look at inspiration first, okay? So when we take a breath in, right, our intercostal muscles, these little muscles in between our ribs, are going to contract. It's going to pull on the ribs, and it's going to allow the ribs to basically elevate. The sternum is going to flare, right? You can all just take a deep breath and experience this. And the diaphragm drops. And that seems a little counterintuitive to some students. But as we inhale, the diaphragm contracts. And when it does so, because of its insertion points, it is actually going to drop and move inferiorly. And so what all these things are going to do is they are going to increase the volume of our thoracic cavity. And as the volume increases, pressure goes down, and it goes down relative to the atmosphere, right? And so because the pressure inside of our lungs, when we do that, is now lower than the atmosphere, it draws air in. And if you think about that, it's so cool, right? And we don't give a lot of thought to how we inhale, but we're not having to go around sucking air, right? It is just this passive process where air is reaching equilibrium after we have worked to contract these muscles. So this is the active piece of inhalation, right? We contract these muscles, intercostals, diaphragm, and then everything else is just drawn passively so that air can reach equilibrium. And it does so when the pressure inside the lungs is the same as the pressure of the atmosphere. So with expiration, it's important to appreciate that this is a passive process. So under normal relaxed expiration with tidal volume, you're not having to force air out. You don't have to blow it out, right? So it's this passive process that relies on elastic recoil of the lungs, spongy like, if you will, okay? So what's going to happen is that these muscles are just going to simply relax now. So the ribs, sternum depressed, intercostals relax, diaphragm moves up as it relaxes. And so all of those muscles relax. What happens to volume? Goes down, pressure goes up relative to the atmosphere, right? So now the pressure inside of our lungs, because the volume has dropped, the pressure inside of our lungs has now gone up. And that air is going to be forced out just in order to reach equilibrium. All right, so I want to turn now to factors that can influence pulmonary ventilation. Another way to think about this is what is going to influence how easily air moves or how much energy is required for us to breathe. So airway resistance, alveolar surface tension, and lung compliance. So let me start with airway resistance first. If you find this equation off-putting, you can think about it in very intuitive terms as well. So let me just walk you through this equation first. So it's saying that flow of air is going to be directly related to changes in pressure. Okay. So if the pressure change between our lungs and the atmosphere if that difference is big, then the flow of air will happen more easily. If the pressure difference is small, then the flow of air won't move as quickly. It is also saying that the flow of air, gases, is inversely related to resistance. And so you could think about resistance as anything that is going to counter the flow of air. And so to go back to this idea of intuitively thinking about it, so this would be a normal airway. This would be an airway during symptoms of bronchitis where those airways are inflamed. And I don't think it's any surprise to any of you that during symptoms, right, these muscles are going to constrict. You have more mucus in these airways. So when all of that happens, the radius of our airways decreases. We are compressing those airways. We are reducing the size of those airways. And in doing so, resistance goes up, right? Moving from a normal airway to one during bronchitis. Asthma also leads to increased resistance, right? What that's going to do is it's going to decrease airflow, decrease gas flow. So to come back to this, you could think about it as gas flow being directly related to differences in pressure, or gas flow being inversely related to resistance. So again, as resistance goes up, flow goes down. Okay, so that's airway resistance. So alveolar surface tension, this has everything to do with surfactant, which is produced in those type 2 alveolar cells. Our lungs are very moist, right? And they are covered on the surface by water molecules. And as water molecules are drawn together, you get hydrogen bonding. You get those attractive forces between water molecules, right? The negative oxygen on one water molecule is drawn to the positive hydrogen on another water molecule. And so that surface tension would cause alveoli to collapse if it weren't for surfactant. So surfactant is a phospholipid. So it has a fatty component, it has a nonpolar component and a polar component. So it can counteract those forces that are going to compel the alveoli to collapse. So it's going to counteract those and ensure that the alveoli stay open. With surfactant, right, it's produced late in the third trimester. So a lot of premature babies don't yet have enough surfactant, and that can impair their pulmonary ventilation, and that's oftentimes seen. So lung compliance is the third of the factors that I want to mention, specifically in regard to pulmonary ventilation. So this comes back to Boyle's law. So it's a measure of the change in lung volume that is going to accompany a given change in transpulmonary, just means across the lungs, pressure. So I think we really need some clinical examples here to appreciate how lung compliance works. So it very much depends on healthy lung tissues. Comes back to that idea of the elastic recoil of the lungs that enables us to exhale passively without putting any effort into the process. So I want you to consider these two scenarios. So fibrosis up here. So this is a normal alveoli, and this is lungs with fibrosis. So you get stiffening of tissues here. So you get these large areas of scarring. That's really what fibrosis means. Thickening of the tissues between those alveoli. A nice little picture here. And then a very different disorder, a very different clinical condition that is categorized as one of the types of COPD is emphysema. So again, normal lungs, normal alveoli, and then these are some of these alveolar sacs with emphysema. And so I want you to think about how I defined compliance and see if you can predict whether compliance will go up or go down in these two situations. So again, consider how lung volume is going to change with a given change in pressure. And so with emphysema, what you see is that so many of these alveolar walls are lost or damaged that the lungs become so loose and floppy that it doesn't take much of a pressure change to cause a big volume change. So with emphysema, the lungs are said to be highly compliant. They are too compliant. Lost the elastic recoil of the lungs. So they do, rather than being able to rely on the elastic recoil of those lungs to exhale, exhalation now becomes an active process. So they are having to expend a tremendous amount of energy just to breathe, just to exhale. And so with fibrosis, you see that the lungs become more compliant. The lungs are so stiff that you need a significant pressure change to maintain a given volume change. So hopefully those two clinical conditions give you a sense for the two extremes with regard to compliance. But again, we're going to see compliance, alveolar surface tension, and the surfactant, as well as resistance of those airways being three key factors that influence pulmonary ventilation, that influence this process of inhalation and exhalation.